I have spent the last two videos talking about the ideological transformations and large-scale organizational changes in the Uruguayan Colorado Party and the Chilean Radical Party in the early 20th century. We are now going to take a closer look at how these parties organized themselves at the grassroots level, and the ways that their party organizations interacted with voters from week to week. In order to do this, we are going to jump ahead slightly to the 1940s, so that we can view both party organizations at the height of their power and influence. The Colorado Party during the 1940s is still organized on the basis of neighborhood political clubs, and even the more conservative sectors of the party have begun to emulate the Batllista neighborhood organizations by the late 40s. These partisan political clubs operate their own physical locales, a building in their neighborhood where the club would hold its meetings and events, and where ordinary voters could go if they wanted to speak to a party activist or get more involved in party activities. These political clubs are an example of a territorial party organization. A given club would do most of its organizing work in just a single neighborhood, and most of the club's activists and members would reside in the same neighborhood where they organized. This map shows the locations of clubs affiliated with the Batllista Colorado Party that had known addresses in the late 40s. I would estimate that the clubs depicted in this map account for somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all of the Batllista clubs that existed at this time. Neighborhood political clubs are absolutely everywhere in Montevideo in the 40s, and it is difficult to walk more than a couple of city blocks without passing a political club affiliated with some faction or party. While many of these clubs disappeared once an election is over, others stayed open year-round, and they provide a variety of services to voters that make the club a center of social life in their neighborhoods. In addition to helping new voters register to vote, a Batllista club might also provide legal aid clinics, or its activists might help voters navigate the government bureaucracy. Many clubs also held night schools that conducted not only political education, but also held classes on other subjects like mathematics, English, or history. A club might also operate its own library with both political and non-political reading materials, and many of the larger and more successful clubs would publish a weekly or monthly newspaper that reported on the club's activities and the internal life of the party organization as a whole. Finally, clubs would also sponsor a variety of cultural events, such as folk music concerts, along with occasional banquets and festivals. Some clubs would do door-to-door canvassing on occasion, but most clubs during this era relied on voters to come to them, and to that end, the activists who run them try to make their club a place where voters would want to spend at least one night a week. These party clubs are more than just mere social clubs, but socializing and recreation are a central part of a political club's strategy for attracting popular support in their neighborhood. A club's influence in party politics depends in part on how many people participate in the club's activities and how frequently they do so. A successful club during this era might have as many as 100 affiliated members, while an additional 200 people might pass through its doors to participate in party activities during the course of a year. But most clubs organized around a much smaller core of activists who would serve on the club's executive committee. These activists would conduct most of the club's day-to-day business, and they would also be responsible for representing the club in both its interactions with their neighbors and in its negotiations with higher-level party officials. I discussed in a previous video how the Batllista Colorado Party had adopted an internally democratic structure in the 1920s that gave many of the club's activists a front row seat in running the party through the weekly convention meetings. This basic structure still exists by the 1940s, but the Batllista Convention loses most of its importance after the Colorado Party reunifies in 1942. The clubs themselves still have a ton of influence in the Colorado Party's internal politics during the mid-20th century, but that influence is now more indirect and informal by the 1940s. In order to explain this new role for the clubs, I first need to go through the basics of Uruguay's rather unusual electoral system. Largely as a response to the factional divisions within the Colorado Party, Uruguay had adopted an electoral system in which each faction of a party runs its own slate of candidates known as a list, and seats in Congress will be distributed proportionally between parties and then between rival factions of the same party, such that the factions that win the most votes would receive a greater share of the party's seats in Congress and other national level offices. The faction candidate lists are closed lists, which means that the seats are allocated between politicians from the same slate based on the order that their name appears on the list of candidates. For example, if a faction won 4 seats in a given election, then those 4 seats would go to the first 4 people on the faction's candidate list. As a result, if you were an aspiring politician, you would want your name to appear as high on your faction's list as possible, because that would maximize your chances of winning elected office. And there would usually be intense competition between politicians from the same faction for the best spots on the candidate list. The Uruguayan neighborhood political clubs influenced this competition in 2 ways. First, the clubs would assort into different factions, and in doing so, they would affect how many votes and thus how many seats in Congress their faction would win. And this in turn could shape the party's broader ideological profile. For example, one of the factors that pushes Batllista further to the left during the 1940s is the fact that its most left-wing and populist faction, List 15, is more successful at attracting the support of the major political clubs compared to the more centrist and pro-establishment List 14 that is led by Jose Batll's sons. By affiliating with different factions, the neighborhood political clubs collectively determine the relative strength of different ideological currents in this diverse and multi-tendency party. The second way that the clubs affected internal competition within the Colorado Party was by influencing the order in which politicians would appear on their faction's list. The Batllista Party tended to decide its candidate selection through internal elections or primaries, and the political clubs were important power brokers in these elections. As a general rule, the politicians who receive the best positions on the candidate lists are those politicians who have the most support from the faction's neighborhood political clubs. However, the clubs do not belong to the politicians that they have endorsed. They are autonomous organizations by this period, and they are free to throw their support to a different candidate in the next election, or even switch to a different faction. If enough clubs change their loyalties at the same time, this could effectively end a politician's career or allow a different up-and-coming politician to win elected office. And so, although the party clubs do not have an especially important formal role in the party organization anymore, they have retained considerable informal influence over what sort of politicians get elected to Congress off of the Colorado Party lists. More broadly, the clubs also come to play an important role as mediators between national politicians and voters, and they are a vital link in a multi-level network of exchanges. The clubs back specific politicians or sub-factions in the party's internal elections, and in the process, they influence the internal politics of the party. One of the things that the clubs get out of this is a set of politicians who share their political views and policy preferences, but many clubs also expect to be rewarded by political favors from that politician, such as the appointment of the club's activists to government positions. The politician relies on the club's ability to command a block of votes that it can deliver to the politician that it has endorsed. And the main way that a club develops a stable block of loyal voters is by providing services and political favors to the residents of their neighborhood year-round. Everybody is getting something out of each level of this relationship, and these exchanges and interactions constitute a form of clientelism that is mediated by the clubs and their activists. Ideology and policy still play an important role in the Batllista clubs during the 40s, but clientelism, political favors, and service provision become increasingly central to the political club's mission during the 50s and 60s. We are now going to turn to the Chilean Radical Party. The primary base unit in the Radical Party is the local assembly. The Radical Assembly is essentially the group of all of the Radical Party members who reside in the same municipality, and by the 40s, the major assemblies in urban areas would typically meet on a weekly basis to discuss party business. We saw in the previous video how the network of radical assemblies gradually expanded during the early 20th century until it encompassed most of the cities and towns of the country. In fact, the Radical Party was the only party that had a stable organizational presence in many of the smaller towns of southern Chile, and this gave them a major electoral advantage over their liberal and conservative rivals. The radicals organized in big cities like Santiago and Valparaiso as well, but their core base of support was always the far-flung provinces of southern and northern Chile. While the radical assemblies were initially active only during election campaigns, by the early 20th century, the assemblies now hold activities on a year-round basis. This graph shows the number of days per month that a radical assembly is mentioned in the newspaper El Mercurio between 1915 and 1922. If these assemblies were still purely temporary and electorally oriented organizations, then their activity would be concentrated around election time. But instead, we see that the assembly is just as active during the long gaps in between elections, which indicates that the assemblies are now organized on a more or less permanent and year-round basis by the early 20th century. The Radical Party statutes state that there can be only one assembly per municipality, and the party leadership generally enforces this rule during the mid-20th century. This municipal-level party organization was well suited for Chile's small to medium-sized provincial towns, but it is becoming rather unwieldy in larger cities like Santiago by the 1940s. The municipality of Santiago has around 600,000 residents by 1940, and the Radical Assembly in Santiago soon becomes so large that it is difficult to get anything done through the assembly meetings. And so the party eventually gives the radical organization in Santiago special dispensation to organize assemblies at the ward level as well. But these ward level assemblies never have very much influence within the party organization, and so the main citywide assembly continues to be the center of action for radical party politics in the capital. In 1940, the Radical Assembly in Santiago mostly operates out of the party headquarters in downtown Santiago, though the party also has an organizational presence in other neighborhoods of the city. Two of the larger ward-level assemblies acquired their own meeting halls during the 1940s, and these meeting halls serve as a sort of party headquarters in that particular neighborhood. By the early 40s, the Radical Party has also developed a series of functional branches, such as the Radical Women's Assembly and party groups for workers, university students, and teachers. Many of these functional groups operate out of the party headquarters, though a few also maintain their own locales in the neighborhoods where they do most of their work. Finally, as I mentioned in the last video, the Radical Youth Wing, or JR, has become the best organized segment of the party by the mid-20th century. In the early 1940s, the Voltaire is still committed to the neighborhood-based model of territorial party activism, and it operates separate branches in every ward of Santiago. In some wards, the Voltaire operates out of the party's other meeting places, such as the party seat or the ward-level assembly hall, but in other wards, the Voltaire maintains its own physical locale. So in summary, the Radical Party in Santiago has a much more complex ecosystem of party organizations compared to the Batllista Party in Montevideo. Despite being a more centralized party organization overall, the Radical Party maintains some sort of headquarters, locale, office, or center in nearly every ward of the city, though the precise nature of this neighborhood party organization varies widely from neighborhood to neighborhood. The party headquarters and the ward assembly buildings also house a technically separate organization called the Radical Club. In contrast to the Batllista clubs in Montevideo, the Radical clubs are devoted almost exclusively to socializing between party members. They would usually contain a lounge, a restaurant, and a bar, and perhaps even a billiards room. Some Radical clubs would also contain a couple of rooms for both official party meetings and more casual gatherings, and they would also have a party library. The main purpose of the Radical Club is to be a space where Radical Party members can come together and socialize in a more casual setting than the main assembly meeting hall next door, and most of the club services are geared towards recreation. In theory, the club services were available only to party members, but this rule tended to be relaxed in Chile's provincial cities and towns. In these smaller towns where there might not be much else going on, the Radical Club would often become a main focal point of social life for the town as a whole, especially for the town's non-Catholic residents who would not have been involved in the local parish. And even though the club's activities were focused primarily on socializing rather than party business, this would still be a useful way for the party to draw a variety of new people into its organizational networks.